Hi guys, welcome back. My name is Madeleine Klein. If you knew that, amazing. If not, I talk about Canadian true crime, missing persons, mystery, and history. And with the high holy holiday of Easter coming up, I thought it would only be appropriate to talk about one of the biggest Catholic Church scandals and cover-ups in Canadian history. Today we're going to talk about the Mount Cashel Orphanage in St. John's, Newfoundland, and how the police and government helped cover up the horrific physical and sexual abuse that over 300 victims suffered over nearly 9 decades. So a little bit of history. The Mount Cashel Orphanage, or also known as the Mount Cashel Boys Home, was opened in 1898 and was originally run by the Congregation of Christian Brothers. In 1950, they would start placing wards of the state in the facility, so kids already in the system or whose parents just couldn't take care of them anymore. It's also around this time that the Christian Brothers of Ireland in Canada took over operation of the facility. I don't know what the difference is between just a regular old congregation of Christian Brothers, but it somehow sounds worse. Anyway, so in October of 1974, 76 years after Mount Cashel opened its doors, the first documented incident of abuse would be reported but ignored. 2 young boys staying at the orphanage, Johnny Williams and Derek O'Brien, would be taken to the Newfoundland Social Services by an aunt of Johnny Williams who had been brutally beaten by a Christian brother. Both boys alleged to the social worker that the Christian brothers working at the facility are regularly physically and sexually abusing the boys that are staying there. But nothing happened because 11 months later, in September of 1975, 2 more boys, Billy Earle and Bobby Connors, are also taken to social services after being beaten by staff. Both boys again tell social workers that physical and sexual abuse are common occurrences at the home. Finally, in October of 1975, the social workers notify the department head of the allegations Billy Earle and Bobby Connors had made the month prior. And there were crickets until December 7th, 1975. A volunteer at the facility contacted RCMP after Shane Earle, Billy's younger brother, had been beaten. He too alleges physical and sexual abuse at the facility. Shane's beating is reported to social services the next day, and he's taken to hospital, where a doctor contacts the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary. Constabulary, that just doesn't sound right to me. The Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, the RNC, is just a police force in Newfoundland. I thought maybe they didn't have RCMP and they had RNC instead, but I googled it and it looks like they have RCMP detachments there too, so I'm super unclear of why the RNC exists. Maybe someone can let me know. Why so many police forces? On December 9th, 1975, the RNC launch an investigation. 24 boys are interviewed, and all of them allege being physically and or sexually abused by Christian brothers. 6 brothers were named: Brother Edward English, Brother Alan Ralph, Brother Joseph Burke, Brother Kevin Short, and Brother Douglas Kenny. That's only 5. I'm missing a name. That's too bad. I need everyone to know who these pedophiles are. Anyway, on December 17th, 1975, 2 Christian brothers, Brother Edward English and Brother Alan Ralph, are interviewed, and both confess to child molestation. But here's where it takes a huge nosedive. The next day, the chief of police orders the case to be closed. The officers that conducted the 26 interviews were told to destroy the report and rewrite it, leaving out any allegations of sexual abuse. Only physical abuse was to be mentioned. By the end of December of 1975, brothers English and Ralph, the ones who confessed, were transferred out of Mount Cashel. Ralph would spend 2 months in treatment in the Southdown Institute in Ontario. Southdown is just another religious facility, and it still exists. Their website states that Southdown was, quote, founded specifically to address the needs of religious and clergy around mental health and addictions, unquote. What does that even mean? I know what it means. It means he got a 2-month vacation before he went back to teaching in 1976. All of the Christian brothers accused of physically or sexually abusing young boys were simply transferred out of province, allowing them to continue to prey on young boys in the name of religion. Brother Edward English was immediately transferred to British Columbia, where he taught grade 8 at St. Thomas More and religious studies at St. Michael's. And throughout the mid-80s, he taught at the Vancouver College. Brother Joseph Burke was in charge of a dorm room at Mount Cashel between 1974 and 1976. He went to British Columbia in 1981 to work at St. Thomas More, the very same school Brother Edward English was transferred to after being found molesting boys in Newfoundland. Brother Kevin Short would join them at St. Thomas More as well. In January of 1976, two journalists from a newspaper called the Evening Telegram learned about the abuse case and prepared to break the story. But for whatever reason, their publisher kiboshed it and it never went to press. On March 3rd, 1976, the Newfoundland Justice Department ordered the chief of police to order the investigating officers to write another report and again leave out any allegations of sex abuse. 10 months later, on January 26, 1977, the cherry-picked report is reviewed by the Deputy Minister of Justice. He tells Chief of Police that there is no need for any further investigation into sexual abuse and officially closes the investigation. Again, crickets until over 2 years later. On April 10th, 1979, an RNC officer was testifying in court on a totally unrelated case. During this, he states that the RNC has been involved in major cover-ups before and uses Mount Cashel as an example. 3 years later, in 1982, another report of sexual abuse comes in and police investigate. Christian brother David Burton would be charged for molestation and sentenced to 4 months in jail and 3 years probation. However, a Newfoundland judge reduced his sentence to 12 days time served and completely wiped his probationary period clean. Why? What? It would be another 7 years before anything else was said about Mount Cashel. On February 3rd, 1989, somebody called in to an open line radio station in Newfoundland. An open line radio station is... well, you know what? It's exactly what it sounds like. So somebody called in and demanded an inquiry into the 1975 RNC investigation into sexual abuse at the orphanage, and even included the fact that the government and police covered it up. That must have been a popular radio station, and the right person must have been listening, because just 12 days later, on February 15th, 1989, the case was reopened, and the next day, Shane Earl would go public with his story. By November of 1989, Mount Cashel announced it would be closing, and the remaining 70 residents were put into foster homes around the province. Between 1989 and 1993, all Christian brothers named were charged and found guilty. In 1989, when charges were finally laid, Brother Edward English was living in Mono Mills, Ontario, and was facing 20 charges. 13 charges of indecent assault, 5 charges of gross indecency, and 2 charges of assault causing bodily harm. In August of 1991, Brother Edward English would be sentenced to 13 years in prison. It would be reduced to 10 years in 1994, but he was living in New Brunswick by 1998. So how much time did he do for these heinous crimes? On April 17th, 1989, Brother Alan Ralph would be charged with 5 counts of indecent assault on young boys. It would take until March of 1993 for Ralph to enter a guilty plea, but he would be sentenced to 4 years, which was later revised to 6, so that's good, I guess. I also read that in May of 1993, just 2 months later, he appeared in front of an Ontario court on 5 sex-related charges. Unfortunately, I couldn't find how that ended, probably with a slap on the wrist. Think about it, if that was before an Ontario court, that was an Ontario case. At least 5 more victims in Ontario. Brother Douglas Kenny was the superintendent at the school, and he was charged with 7 counts of indecent assault. In May of 1992, he would be sentenced to 5 years, which would later be up to 7. Brother Kevin Short was charged with 1 count of gross indecency, and in December of 1990, he was charged for sexually abusing a 14-year-old boy in British Columbia. In November of 91, he enters a guilty plea to 3 counts of gross indecency and assault and is sentenced to 4 years. Brother Joseph Burke was working as a vice principal when he was charged for his crimes he committed at Mount Cashel. He would be convicted and sentenced to 2 years, but served no time. He would go back to British Columbia and continue to abuse students. In 2013, he was suspended with pay for physical abuse, and the allegations of sexual abuse are as recent as 2007 to 2009. The plaintiff in that case was in grade 8 in 2007. That means he's my age. I finished grade 8 and started grade 9 in 2007. This monster, Joseph Burke, abused generations of children across multiple provinces. It's unfathomable. All of these men brutally tortured and raped young boys for decades and faced little to no repercussions, all in the name of God. It's absolutely mind-boggling and despicable, and it's not a thing of the past. Students are still abused, and religion continues to traumatize young minds. The most recent case I can think of being the legacy of abuse from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I'll be talking about the legacy of abuse hopefully next week, depending on how editing goes, but it might be the week after that. The church is a cult and a boys' club, and police and government have a long-standing history of supporting and enabling an evil, abusive system and continue to do so. And I know I'll have some people defending others at these facilities saying, all of these people aren't bad. But I compare it to how I compare it to there are no good cops. The good ones know about the bad ones and allow the abuse and continue to enforce a corrupt system. I paint all the staff at these schools with the same brush because you won't convince me they didn't know what was happening. The ring runs so deep, it would make your head spin. It makes my head spin. At first, I couldn't believe that a cover-up of this magnitude happened in Canada and the perpetrators got a slap on the wrist. How everything was just swept under the rug and these men were simply transferred so that they could continue to abuse young boys and ruin lives. But the more I looked into it, it's still happening today. A staggering amount of Mount Cashel victims faced a lifetime of PTSD, anxiety, depression, substance abuse issues. Some have committed suicide and many have attempted at least once. I imagine all of the brothers that sexually abused boys as adults were most likely molested in the same way in the same environment. That's not a fact, just my speculation, as there is no history available on these Christian brothers. But there has got to be an earlier documented report of abuse. There has to be. I imagine that place was a nightmare from the day it opened. Holy hell from day one. So I think that concludes the first episode of my anti-Easter series. Yes, I've decided to make this a little series. As mentioned before, if editing goes swimmingly, I'll be talking about the legacy of abuse next week from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I've got something special and different planned for that one, but it might take me a little bit longer, so we'll see. Hopefully next week, if not, 2 weeks. Anyway, I better start wrapping this up. I am rambling. Thank you guys so much for being here again. I super appreciate you as always. Like, subscribe, comment, share, write me love letters, hate mail. I love engagement. Anyway, thank you guys again. Be safe out there. Don't join any cults, and I'll catch you next week. Bye.